I never thought I'd be that guy. The one with the dramatic HOA story that people share on social media. Yet here I am. My name is Marcus Chen, a 42-year-old software engineer who'd struck gold with a startup I founded 5 years ago. After the company went public, I finally had the means to build my dream home in Oak Ridge Estates, an upscale gated community in Northern California. The community looked perfect from the outside: immaculate lawns, pristine sidewalks, and homes that belonged in architectural magazines. The realtor had mentioned there was an active HOA, but assured me they simply maintained the community's standards. I should have read between the lines. Within my first week, I received a welcome basket and an intimidatingly thick binder of HOA regulations. The welcome card was signed by Veronica Harrington, HOA president, with a personal note: "Looking forward to having you as a neighbor. Please review our community guidelines thoroughly." Veronica was in her late 50s with perfectly highlighted blonde hair, always dressed in designer clothes, and perpetually wore an expression that suggested she just smelled something unpleasant. During my first community gathering, she made it a point to introduce herself and comment on my interesting choice of landscape design, despite it matching the approved plans exactly. I first noticed something was off when I received a notice about my trash bins being visible from the street. On trash day, mind you, a full 4 hours after collection. The letter cited Regulation 17.3b and included a courtesy warning, rather than a fine this time. The following week, I received another notice about a vehicle parked in my driveway. The issue: my recently purchased Rolls-Royce Dawn convertible was deemed ostentatious and potentially disruptive to community aesthetic. The letter suggested I keep it garaged when not in use, citing a vague clause about vehicles that detract from neighborhood harmony. I laughed it off as a misunderstanding. Little did I know this was just the opening salvo in what would become an all-out war with the Oak Ridge Estates HOA and its iron-fisted leader. 2 weeks after the car notice, I returned home from a business trip to find an official violation letter in my mailbox. According to the notice, my Rolls-Royce had been parked in my driveway for 3 consecutive days while I was away, resulting in a $200 fine for persistent aesthetic violation. I was baffled. The car was parked on my own property, not blocking anything, and certainly not violating any specific rule I could find in the handbook. I immediately called the HOA office and requested a meeting with Veronica. She agreed, though her tone suggested I was inconveniencing her immensely. The next day, I arrived at the community clubhouse to find Veronica and 2 other board members waiting with stern expressions. I presented my case calmly, pointing out that nowhere in the regulations did it specifically state luxury vehicles couldn't be parked in driveways. "Mr. Chen," Veronica said with a condescending smile, "Section 22.4 clearly states that vehicles that disturb the visual harmony of the community are subject to parking restrictions. Your extravagant car creates an impression of inequality and ostentation that makes other residents uncomfortable." Inequality. I repeated, stunned by her reasoning. I worked hard for 15 years to afford that car. "Perhaps," Veronica replied with a tight smile, "but in Oak Ridge, we believe in maintaining a certain subtle elegance. Your vehicle suggests new money flamboyance rather than tasteful prosperity." The other board members nodded in agreement. One of them, Gerald, a retired banker with perpetually reddened cheeks, added, "We've had complaints, Mr. Chen. People don't move to Oak Ridge to see their neighbors flaunt their wealth." I looked around the room, noting Veronica's Hermes scarf and Gerald's Rolex. The hypocrisy was stunning. "I'll review the regulations again," I said, keeping my voice level, "but I believe you're stretching the interpretation beyond reason." "The board has discretion in these matters," Veronica replied coolly. "The fine stands, and we expect compliance moving forward." As I left the meeting, I overheard Veronica mutter to Gerald, "These tech nouveau riche just don't understand decorum." That night, I garaged my car and began reading the HOA regulations word by word. This wasn't just about a car anymore. This was about principle. Over the next month, the violations began arriving with alarming frequency. First, my lawn was 1.2 inches above regulation height in one corner. Then, the morning glory vines I'd planted were deemed invasive species, despite being on the approved plant list. Next came a citation for excessive holiday decoration for the single, tasteful wreath on my front door in December. Each violation came with increasingly hefty fines, and my appeals were systematically denied. I began documenting everything, taking daily photos of my property and noting identical violations throughout the neighborhood that somehow escaped Veronica's attention. The breaking point came when my neighbor Eleanor, a retired professor who had lived in Oak Ridge for 20 years, received a violation for the bird feeders in her backyard. Feeders that had been there for over a decade without issue. She was nearly in tears when she showed me the $500 fine. "They've never bothered about my birds before," she said, hands trembling. "But after I spoke up for you at the last community meeting, suddenly my feeders are unsanitary attractions for vermin." I was stunned. "You defended me." Eleanor nodded. "When Veronica started going on about how your car was lowering property values and attracting unwanted attention, I pointed out that several board members drive luxury vehicles. She didn't appreciate that. That evening, I invited Eleanor and a few other neighbors who had experienced similar targeting to my home. As we shared stories, a pattern emerged. Anyone who opposed Veronica or the board quickly found themselves buried in violations and fines. James, who lived at the corner, revealed that after questioning the dramatic increase in landscaping fees, he received violations for his children's basketball hoop, which had been in place for years. Patricia, a young mother, had been fined repeatedly for noise violations after speaking against the board's decision to convert the community playground into additional parking. "It's not just petty," said Thomas, an attorney who lived across the street. "Some of this might actually be illegal. These selective enforcements, the arbitrary interpretations of rules. There's a case here." As my neighbors left that night, I made two decisions. First, I moved my Rolls-Royce back to the driveway. Second, I began researching HOA laws in California. If Veronica wanted a wall, I would give her one. The next morning, I awoke to find my car covered in post-it notes, each bearing a single word: shame. The post-it incident was just the beginning. 2 days later, I received a certified letter informing me that due to ongoing violations and refusal to comply with community standards, the HOA was imposing a $5,000 fine and placing a lien on my property. The letter further stated that if all fines weren't paid within 30 days, foreclosure proceedings would begin. I immediately called Thomas, my attorney neighbor, who reviewed the letter with growing alarm. "This is completely disproportionate," he said. "They're supposed to offer hearings, reasonable time to comply, and mediation before even considering a lien. They skipped multiple legal steps." That afternoon, when I returned from a meeting, I found a tow truck in my driveway and Veronica standing beside it, arms crossed triumphantly. The driver was preparing to hook up my Rolls-Royce. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" I demanded, blocking the tow operator. Veronica thrust a paper toward me. "Emergency removal of non-compliant vehicle, but HOA emergency powers, Section 41. I snatched the paper. It was a resolution signed that morning by the board granting emergency powers to remove hazardous or community-damaging elements without notice. Somehow, my luxury car had been classified as a community hazard. "This is insane," I said. "My car is not a hazard. This is personal harassment. It's creating community tension," Veronica replied smoothly. "Several residents have complained about feeling uncomfortable with such ostentatious displays of wealth. It's affecting mental wellness in our community." The tow operator looked uncomfortable. "Look, I don't want to get in the middle of anything illegal," he said. Is this car on private property or community property? Private, I said firmly. HOA has jurisdiction, Veronica countered. I turned to Veronica, keeping my voice level despite my rage. Touch my car, and I'll sue not just the HOA, but each board member personally. Something in my tone must have registered because Veronica hesitated. After a tense standoff, she dismissed the tow operator, but not before delivering her parting shot. This isn't over, Mr. Chen. Perhaps you don't understand how things work here, but Oak Ridge has standards. People like you either learn to fit in or find themselves very uncomfortable. That evening, I discovered my security cameras had captured everything, including Veronica placing the post-it notes on my car 2 nights earlier. Even more damning, I had footage of her telling another board member before the tow truck arrived. Once we break him on this car thing, we can push through the special assessment for the clubhouse renovation. His lot has the highest allocation. The pieces suddenly clicked into place. The targeted harassment wasn't just about my car. It was about forcing compliance for an upcoming vote on a $2 million renovation project Veronica had been championing. I spent the night researching and making calls. By morning, I had a plan. Veronica had no idea who she was dealing with, or what I discovered about Oak Ridge Estate's finances. The morning after the tow truck incident, I filed a formal complaint with the California Department of Real Estate regarding HOA harassment and selective enforcement. Next, I submitted a demand letter through Thomas to the HOA board requesting all financial records for the past 5 years, meeting minutes, election results, and vendor contracts. California law requires HOAs to provide these documents within 10 business days. Predictably, the deadline came and went with no response. Meanwhile, I discovered Oak Ridge's digital Achilles heel. Their community website was embarrassingly outdated, with virtually no security measures. Using my tech background, I legally accessed the public-facing documents section and discovered a goldmine of information the board likely thought was inaccessible. Buried in committee reports were discussions of special vendor arrangements and preferred contractor incentives, euphemisms for kickbacks. Most damning was an email chain accidentally uploaded where Veronica discussed using HOA fines to cover a budget shortfall caused by administrative consulting fees paid to a company called VH Enterprises. A quick business entity search revealed VH Enterprises was registered to Vernon Harrington, Veronica's husband. While gathering evidence, I also began building community support. I created a private online forum for Oak Ridge residents and shared my experiences, inviting others to do the same. The response was overwhelming. Nearly half the community had experienced similar targeted enforcement after questioning the board. Eleanor organized a series of coffee chats, where residents could discuss concerns in a comfortable setting. Attendance grew from 8 people to over 40 within 2 weeks. Thomas helped residents file their own document requests, flooding the HOA office with legally mandated paperwork. The administrative assistant, overwhelmed by the sudden workload, let slip that the board had never properly trained her on records requests because they rarely get any. Our most unexpected ally came in the form of Richard Wellington, a founding member of Oak Ridge who had served on the original board 15 years earlier. Now in his 70s, he was appalled by what the HOA had become. This community was never meant to be run like a dictatorship, he told our group. The regulations were designed to maintain property values, not punish residents for personal vendettas. Richard provided copies of the original CC and Rs, which were significantly less restrictive than the current version. It appeared the board had been gradually adding amendments without proper community votes. 28 days after my initial demand for documents, I received a response from the HOA's lawyer offering limited access to heavily redacted financial records. The letter cited administrative burden and confidentiality concerns as reasons for non-compliance. That same day, another violation notice appeared on my door, this time claiming my home's exterior paint, which had been pre-approved, was non-compliant with community aesthetic standards. The fine was $10,000, with a 7-day deadline to repaint. I smiled as I read it. Veronica was getting desperate. The trap was about to spring. With Richard's help, I called for an emergency community meeting, citing a bylaw that allowed residents to convene with 30% support. We had signatures from 52% of homeowners. The night of the meeting, the community clubhouse was packed. Veronica and the board sat at their usual table, looking uncomfortable at the unprecedented turnout. When Veronica tried to limit discussion time, residents shouted her down. I took the floor and projected my presentation onto the wall. For the past 3 months, I've been systematically targeted by this board. I began, displaying a timeline of violations against me alongside identical, unfined violations at board members' homes. But this isn't about me. It's about a pattern of selective enforcement and financial mismanagement affecting all of us. The room fell silent as I revealed what we'd found. The clubhouse renovation Veronica championed would be managed by her husband's company at a 40% markup above market rate. The landscaping company had been charging for services never performed. The board had been using HOA funds for personal expenses, including Veronica's business trip to a spa resort. Most damning was the revelation that fines collected weren't going into community improvements as required by law, but instead into a discretionary fund controlled solely by Veronica. This isn't just unethical, Thomas added, stepping forward. Some of this is illegal. Veronica's face had turned ghostly white. These are baseless accusations, she sputtered. This presentation is unauthorized and… Is it baseless? Gerald interrupted, surprising everyone. The usually loyal treasurer looked shaken. Veronica, you told me those consulting fees were for legitimate services. The board began fracturing before our eyes. Patricia, the young mother who'd been fined for playground noise, stood up. I've documented 37 instances when my children were playing during permitted hours, yet received violations. Meanwhile, board members' grandchildren used the pool after hours without consequence. More residents came forward with stories and evidence. By meeting's end, 3 board members had publicly resigned, leaving only Veronica and her closest ally standing. We moved for a vote of no confidence in the remaining board, Richard announced, citing the bylaws. Veronica, finally recognizing her position, attempted damage control. Perhaps there have been some administrative oversights, she conceded. But everything I've done has been for the good of Oak Ridge, including putting a line on my house for parking my own car in my own driveway. I asked quietly. The vote was nearly unanimous. Veronica and her ally were removed, and a temporary board was established until formal elections could be held. As the meeting concluded, Veronica approached me, her composure cracking. You have no idea what you've done, she hissed. I built this community. Without my leadership, property values will plummet. Actually, I replied, I think values might improve once prospective buyers realize they won't be terrorized in their own homes. What I didn't tell her was that the next day would bring even bigger revelations. The morning after the emergency meeting, I received an unexpected visitor, FBI Agent Carlson, who specialized in white-collar crime and real estate fraud. We've been investigating several HOAs in this county, she explained as we sat in my living room. Your complaints and evidence collection provided the connection we needed between cases. It turned out Veronica's scheme wasn't limited to Oak Ridge. She and her husband had been running similar operations in 3 other communities, using their positions to funnel contracts to shell companies and intimidate residents into compliance. Agent Carlson requested copies of all our evidence, which I gladly provided. This will significantly strengthen our case, she said. Later that day, as news of the federal investigation spread through the community, Veronica made her final desperate move. She and 4 supporters entered the HOA office, removed computers and files, and changed the locks, claiming the emergency meeting had been procedurally invalid. Thomas immediately filed for an emergency injunction, which was granted within hours. When sheriff's deputies arrived to enforce it, they discovered Veronica attempting to shroud financial documents. The community gathered outside the clubhouse, watching in shock as Veronica was escorted out, boxes of evidence confiscated. Several news vans had arrived, turning our HOA dispute into the lead story on local stations. That evening, we held another community meeting, this time focused on healing and moving forward. The temporary board, led by Richard and including Eleanor and Thomas, presented a plan to revise the CC and Rs to their original intent, establish transparent financial practices, and create an ethics committee to prevent future abuses. As the meeting concluded, a sleek black car pulled into the parking lot. A distinguished older gentleman emerged, Robert Woodward, CEO of the development company that had built Oak Ridge 20 years earlier. "I've been following the situation," he told the assembled residents. "This community was meant to be our flagship development, an example of elegant living with reasonable governance. I'm appalled at what it became under Ms. Harrington's leadership." Woodward announced his company would provide legal support for residents who had been unfairly fined and would help fund the rebuilding of proper HOA governance. "Sometimes," he said, "you need to tear down corrupted structures to restore the original vision." The next morning, as I moved my Rolls-Royce from the garage to the driveway, where it would now remain without harassment, I noticed something remarkable. Neighbors who had previously avoided eye contact were waving. Several stopped to chat. One even complimented the car. That afternoon, the interim board made its first official announcement. All outstanding fines were suspended pending review, and all loans placed within the past year would be immediately released. My phone rang. It was a reporter from the San Francisco Chronicle. "Mr. Chen," she said, "we're doing a feature on HOA abuses across California. Would you be willing to share your story?" "Absolutely," I replied. It's time people understood what can happen when these organizations go unchecked. 6 months after what Oak Ridge residents now called the rebellion, our community had transformed. The new board, elected in a record turnout vote, had implemented transparent financial practices, reasonable enforcement guidelines, and a resident review process for all major decisions. Veronica and her husband faced multiple federal charges for fraud, embezzlement, and conspiracy. 5 other board members received lesser charges for their roles in the scheme. The investigation had expanded to 12 other HOAs across 3 states, uncovering a network of kickbacks and intimidation tactics. My role in exposing the corruption had made me something of a reluctant celebrity in HOA reform circles. I'd been invited to speak at several community association conferences and had consulted with state legislators drafting new HOA oversight laws. The Rolls-Royce rule, as it became known in legal circles, established that HOAs could not selectively enforce aesthetic guidelines based on perceived wealth or status. Several similar cases across the country cited our precedent. One sunny Saturday morning, as I washed my car in the driveway, an activity previously forbidden by Veronica's board, Eleanor brought over a housewarming gift for our newest neighbor. "Can you believe it's been a year since all this started?" she asked, watching children play freely on the once restricted community lawn. "Best war I ever fought," I replied with a smile. We had turned the clubhouse into a true community center, hosting classes, game nights, and monthly forums where residents could voice concerns without fear. The special assessment Veronica had planned for her husband's company was redirected to improve the playground and add a community garden. As we chatted, a silver Bentley pulled into the driveway across the street. Our newest resident, a retired surgeon who'd been drawn to Oak Ridge after reading about our community's transformation. "Nice car," I called out with a wave. "Thanks," he replied. "I heard this was a place where you could park whatever you wanted without hassle." Eleanor laughed. Times have certainly changed. Later that week, I received a small package in the mail. No return address. Inside was a single post-it note with the word "respectee" written on it, along with a newspaper clipping about Veronica's guilty plea and 5-year sentence. That evening, at our monthly community dinner in the clubhouse, Richard raised a toast to Marcus, whose refusal to be bullied over a beautiful car ended up saving our community. The room erupted in applause. Thomas added, "And to the most expensive car in HOA history, worth every penny." As I looked around at my neighbors, now friends, I realized that what had started as a simple parking dispute had created something invaluable. A truly functional community where regulations served residents instead of controlling them. The final irony came 3 months later, when Oak Ridge Estates won a Community of Excellence award from the National Association of Homeowners. The prize? A feature in Luxury Living magazine, with my Rolls-Royce prominently displayed in the cover photo, parked proudly in my driveway, exactly where it belonged. Sometimes standing your ground isn't just about principle, it's about protecting the very concept of community itself.